the relationship between Islam and indigenous Africa, because that's something else they don't really have a grasp on, which is what the relationship was between indigenous African societies and the religion of Islam. Okay? And the fact of the matter is that the religion of Islam was indigenized, thoroughly indigenized. African cultures were Islamized, but Islam was indigenized. So African cultures were Islamized, and Islam was, I don't want to say Africanized, but it was situated, it was assimilated within the African milieu, if you will. And one of the reasons, and there are different examples of how Islam in Africa, in sub-Saharan, what we call sub-Saharan Africa, was notably distinct from Islam in the rest of the Muslim world, even immediately to the north among the Berbers. There was a distinct sub-Saharan West African society or culture that was the product of an enterprise of native West Africans. So this brings to light another point about Arabs in Africa. Arabs did not force Islam on indigenous Africans and then stand over them and make sure they were practicing it properly. Africans voluntarily adopted Islam and then owned and operated how it functioned within African society. It was a completely indigenous affair. Mm-hmm. Completely indigenous affair. I'll give you an example, okay? You can even resort to Sheikh Anta Diop's book, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, where he, goes into detail about this. But, Afrocentrists for the longest would assert that Ghana, by way of conquest by a federation of Berbers who established an empire in Morocco, Algeria, and Spain in the 11th century, known as the Almoravids. Okay? They were saying that these Almoravids introduced Islam into Ghana by force when they conquered Ghana and Ghana fell. I've heard Clark mention the Omahads and the Almoravids before. Okay? Well, here's the thing, right? This event that supposedly took place in the 11th century, in which Islam was forced on sub-Saharan, and in which Islam was forced on the people of Ghana in the 11th century by Arabs. This event does not appear anywhere in the literature of that era.
I actually read about that, and I read that it was a complete fabrication.
Yeah, I mean, it's not in West African traditions or in secondary sources past a certain point. We know people were in the habit of narrating their conquests. So it is beyond suspicion that we can't find it mentioned. And in an article entitled The Conquest That Never Was by David Conrad and Humphrey Fisher, which appeared in what's called The History of Africa, they write about this controversy on page 53. And they say on page 53, quote, in part one of this paper, they're talking about their discussion of this supposed Arab conquest of Ghana. They said in part one of this paper, we examined the external written sources and found no unambiguous evidence that an Almoravid conquest of ancient Ghana ever occurred. The local oral evidence reviewed in this part of our study supports our earlier hypothesis in that we find nothing in the traditions to indicate any conquest of the 11th century Sahelian state known to Arab geographers as, quote, Ghana. Indeed, the oral traditions emphasize drought as having had much to do with the eventual disintegration of the Soninke state known locally as Ouagadougou. The way that Islam enters into the Sahel and sub-Saharan West Africa is by Arab and African merchants carrying out commerce across the Sahara Desert. And from these African merchants, kings, and leaders of tribes embraced Islam, and their subjects then followed. Sheikh Anta Diop described this process as auto-imitation in pre-colonial black Africa, where he says that African conversion to Islam was a top-down process where the African elites, royalty and aristocrat, converted to the religion, giving it a regal status, and that was then adopted by the rest of the village. So the religion was indigenized to meet the needs of the specific lineage group that converted. Force was never the primary process by which Islam enters and settles in sub-Saharan Africa. African sovereignty was intact during the spread of Islam, and this is the main reason that the religion was so rapidly and easily indigenized.
How could 4,000 Arabs take over all of Egypt? You know, and he doesn't offer an answer. But, you know, the answer is that Egypt was under Roman occupation. The Romans, or the Byzantines, which was the eastern wing of the Roman Empire, were what today we call Catholic. And the Copts, the Coptic Church of Alexandria, it was considered unofficial Christian sect because they were not a part of the official church of Europe. So the Copts had experienced quite a bit of discrimination at the hands or under the authority of the Byzantine church. And the Muslims were able to secure their assistance in helping them overthrow the Romans in Egypt. Even John Henrik Clarke makes reference to this. Even when John Henrik Clarke makes reference to this, only to suggest that the Arabs replaced the Byzantines as oppressors and usurpers, he still identifies the fact that, you know, it is their willingness their desire to get rid of the Romans that enabled the Arabs to take over. Okay, now the thing we have to understand is that the spread across the rest of North Africa was not an Arab enterprise the further you got westward. That the spread of Islam was more so of a passing of the baton, in which the people became Muslim and then they, would go on to spread Islam from there. And they did not impose the religion. That is, they did not force people to convert to Islam when they invaded a region. As everyone well knows, there are, within the Muslim state, polity, there's, of course, Muslims, okay, and they have official recognition by the Muslim state or Muslim polity. And then there are what's called dhimmis, who are non-Muslims, usually people of the book, who pay a poll tax called the jizya, which is sort of a protection tax. And that tax is what they pay as non-Muslims to exist in peace in the Muslim realm, where they are exempt from military service in exchange for having they can't occupy political positions within the Muslim state. And sometimes Muslims abided by that, sometimes they didn't, because we have examples of non-Muslims occupying offices within the Muslim realm. This is one of the things that we discover between the correspondence of Amr, who was the one who brought the Muslims into Egypt, and Umar ibn Khattab, the Khalifa. But the thing is that these dhimmis were not Muslim, and they had to pay a poll tax in exchange for keeping their religion, keeping their native religion. Well, what ended up happening was a lot of, in these realms, the Muslims discouraged these dhimmis from converting to Islam because it would mean that they would lose that major source of revenue. So there was, for whatever, whether you want to say it's for, sort of secular ulterior motives, they actually discouraged conversion when they took over North Africa, because the non-Muslims were such a vital revenue source for the Muslim polity, the Muslim state.
Well, it spread a variety of ways. It spread, and this is again part of the problem with the Afrocentric, well, the conscious community, is that they try to reduce the role of Islam in Africa to slavery and violence, which just simply you cannot do. When Islam ventured or began to spread, well, first of all, let me say this. Let me say this. The first example of the first people to embrace Islam were those in Mecca, free and slaves. Those who were slaves fled from their slave owners to respond to the call of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Islam. They were not introduced to Islam through slave owners or slave masters. On the contrary, from very early, Islam would have been viewed as synonymous with emancipation, with this new, movement inside the Arabian Peninsula. The second event that introduced Islam to black people was the Hijrah al-Awwal, the first Hijrah, in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent his persecuted followers with an envoy into Ethiopia, the kingdom of Abyssinia, in the area which I think is present-day Eritrea. There, while seeking asylum, the first free Muslim community existed in a sovereign black African kingdom, where they gained new converts under the authority of the Negus. Today, Ethiopia and Eritrea have a robust Muslim population whose origins can be traced directly to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So from these two examples, the first, quote, black Muslims were not slaves or were imposed upon by outside invaders, but were people who fled slavery and persecution in the 7th century to accept a new spiritual movement that to them represented liberation. Now, the areas where Islam did spread through violence was North Africa. And the reason Islam enters into North Africa through an army is in order for the Muslims to confront Rome. Here is the uncomfortable fact that many Afrocentrists either don't want to deal with or are totally unaware of. Okay? North Africa, particularly Egypt, was at the time the Muslims entered that region under the occupation of the Roman Empire. There was not a sitting pharaoh that the Muslims came and knocked off. The third intermediate period, which is the period in which Kemetic Egypt, native Egypt, actually declines and eventually disappears, happened some 1400 years prior to the Muslim invasion. During that time, between that time, you had the invasion of the Sea People, Carthage, Phoenicians, some Vandals, Greeks, and Romans. So the racial constitution, the African identity of North Africa and Egypt in particular, had been compromised some over a millennium with some several centuries prior to when the Muslims first arrived in 642 ACE. And proof of that, or evidence of that, is when the Muslims arrived in 642 ACE, in order to confront Rome, in order to make it to the steeps of the Roman Empire, they encountered the Muwaqis, or the Archbishop of the Coptic Church of Alexandria. This is the native church of ancient Egypt, which predates European Christendom by, centuries. So they enter into the Coptic, they enter into Alexandria, and when the Arabs
when the Arab army confront the so-called native archbishop of ancient of Alexandria of Egypt, what does this archbishop say upon seeing the leader of the Arabs, Amr ibn as-Samit was his name? What does he say when he sees Amr, General Amr? He says to the other Arabs, "Take this black man away from me. I don't want to have any dealings with him." This is what the non-European native Egyptian who was there at the time, whom the Arabs encountered at the time of their invasion of Egypt in the 7th century. He looks at the Arab general and says to the other Arabs around him, "Take this black man out of my face. I don't want to have anything to do with him." Now, few things can be deduced from that. Number one, the leader of the Arabs into Egypt, the general, was black. This opens up the door to, I guess you can speculate, and it would infer how many other black folk were a part of the army and in positions of leadership within the early Islamic Caliphate, or what we as Sunnis call the Khilafah al-Rashidun, right? So there's that. Secondly, there's the fact that, based on this exchange, that at the time, the native population of Egypt, when the Muslims arrived in the 7th century, was not black. So there's part of the Afrocentric argument, or the conscious community's argument there, which is just gone. Now, the Arabs, who were not as dark as this brother in complexion, responded to al-Muwaffiq and said, the archbishop, and said, "Look, we have thousands of black folk." I'm, paraphrasing. We have thousands of black people in positions of leadership, both at home and making up our army. He said, "You have to deal with him. You have to deal with him."
Well, first of all, Ma'at doesn't exist. The ancient Egyptian religion, as practiced by the Egyptians, the Kemetic religion of over 2,400 years ago, does not exist anywhere. The beliefs, practices, the system that held them together have not been preserved anywhere or in any way since 1071 BCE, when dynastic Egypt began its decline and eventually disappeared around 680 BCE. So today's so-called conscious community claiming Ma'at are actually pushing a pastiche of underdeveloped concepts that do not have the benefit of a system. Since there is no system in place, which we mean by system, doctrine, rules, taboos, rituals, rites, sacrifices, and lineage, their teachings, their faux metaphysics, lack integrity. A, there is no shared criteria by which its subscribers can be held accountable, and B, there is no way of transferring the precepts from one generation to the next. These are fatal flaws since they prevent any idea from becoming a communal way of life. What the so-called conscious community preaches today is an anachronistic representation of ancient Ma'at that only goes back about 50 years. So no, the science that they're dealing with is not older than Islam, because it has no legitimate link to the actual civilization that it claims as its origin. You can't claim someone is your father just because you look similar. That alone is an evidence. Also, in reference to the claim that ancient Kemet is that the Ma'atic system is the essential Africa. This is not something that was agreed upon by the rest of Africa, which brings us to a major problem within Afrocentrist and particularly conscious community thinking. That is, they do not deal with Africa as it actually existed and as it currently exists. They deal with Africa from a purely cultural nationalist standpoint, which posits a puritanical view of African culture based on their own whims and misconceptions and preconceived notions and biases. It is imaginary in every sense of the word. It is anachronistic. It is pastiche. It is not real. It is not even a disciplined, theoretical
conceptualization of African history and culture. So when they say, well, Islam is not a part of the or is not indigenous or is not native to Africa, in the way in which Africans deal with that, when you go there, Islam was there long enough to be considered native because it's been indigenized. So you have the Yoruba who are not, you have Yoruba who are, they may be, some Yoruba are Muslim, some Yoruba are Christian, some Yoruba practice Yoruba. And yet you have those who are neither Muslim or Christian, but who practice what we call the indigenous or traditional African religion, who may employ aspects of Islam into their rituals, such as, recite Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas in their rituals. There's even been examples of how members of the Sahabi have made their way into the Orishas in some parts of the diaspora. So Islam in particular, because that's the subject we're focused on, has been indigenized, and that is enough for the Africans. It is a force of history. It is a cultural staple of Africa's historical identity. There is no essential religious Africa that can be superimposed upon the rest of the continent. When you read Sheikh Anta Diop's work, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, the way in which Islam has being dealt with, A, by this African, and two, how he's describing how it was dealt with by the early African, completely contradicts their version of events